Welcome back to another episode of the Ink and Impact podcast. Today, I am joined by Kim Stewart, who is a Jesus Girl, wife and mom, podcast publicist, and host of the Book Marketing Mania podcast, which I'm a fan of, by the way. As a publicist and marketing strategist, she has been blessed to serve incredible authors and PR agencies since 2015. Her sweet spot is strategy, and she's super passionate about helping authors strategically share their life-changing messages. So welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here and serve your listeners
Oh, so glad
today.
to have you. So, this is the first time I've had a marketing publicist, especially one for authors. And I just think that's so fascinating. I want to just ask you a couple questions about that in a minute. But
Yeah.
since you're my first time guest, I always ask first time guests this question, which is what is one book, in addition to the Bible, of course, that significantly impacted you in some way?
Yeah. Well, of course, there's been so many because I'm an avid reader.
Yes.
I'm going to share about one that's had a huge impact on my life as an adult and my business journey, or that led to my business journey. I
Okay.
even say is Made to Crave by Lisa Turkhurst. I don't know if you know
Mhm.
Lisa. She's the president of Proverbs 31 Ministries, and just because of the type of book it was, it's all about, craving God over food. So it was about, kind of a weight loss journey that I was on at the time. But what was super cool was how I found out about that book was way back. I think it was released 10 or 11 years ago, way before all the social media. How we connected that way was I was on a forum for digital scrapbookers, and we were talking about doing a challenge to scrapbook our weight loss journey. And someone mentioned she had, I think there was like a free devotional that she had offered on the internet. And somebody, told me about it. And I was like, oh gosh, that's definitely what I need. And I just fell in love with her writing and just the way that she communicated. She had this similar struggle that I did, and she turned to God's word instead and, got through her food struggles. And then she wanted to, share her journey with others and impact their lives and help them through the same struggle. And I've seen that theme over and over in so many Christian living books I've read. But I just love that it was, she helped me transform my life, and it's still a journey I'm on, but she's helped me so much. But then she really encouraged me to dig into God's word and find the solutions that he has for me in there. So I love serving Christian authors, and I'll relate it really honestly back to her book is kind of what started me on this journey. So it's
Oh,
transformed my life and my business as well. So yeah.
what a great story. I love that that book impacted you in that way. And it just goes to prove to our listeners that no matter what genre or what topic you're writing about, you can have a significant impact on your readers while glorifying the Lord in the same.
So true.
So great. So you said that kind of started you on your journey a little bit with your business. So can you kind of walk us through how you got into the PR agency and working with authors specifically?
Yeah, so I guess it was like 2014. So once I discovered Lisa and Proverbs 31 Ministries, I had been getting their daily devotionals and going to their online Bible study. And somewhere along the way, I got an email about the She Speaks conference for writers and speakers. And I really felt like God had put a little bit of a calling on my heart to write a book. I'm a mom of a special needs adult son. And so I felt like there was a journey there to share. And so I kind of felt that tug, and I signed up to go to the conference and went. And if anybody has ever gone, I don't know if you've gone to Lane, but it's an amazing conference. And it's like 800 women, all with the same kind of calling, all there to support each other and learn everything about writing, publishing, and blogging and podcasting, and it just goes on and on of all the new stuff we can learn. Uh, Went and absorbed it all, and I came home and I didn't do anything with it. I had like started a little blog, but I wasn't really writing about it. So the next year came around and I was like, okay, it's time to go back and take it a little bit more seriously. So I went back, but I really felt at that conference, and it was sitting in one of Lisa's sessions with Karen Eman. They were talking about baking your marketing into your book. And it seemed like that session and other sessions I was drawn about marketing. And I really honestly in that session felt speak to me that it was like, hey, I didn't really call you here to write a book. Like me and you still have a journey to go on. You're not ready to write a book yet, but I'm here for you to serve this community because I have a background in corporate marketing. And I think, he just called me to merge those skills of my corporate marketing and my passion for marketing with, I talk to anybody about marketing, their businesses and books. So I think he just wanted me to mesh those. Like he wanted me to get into that community and really learn about writing, publishing, and marketing books that I love to read, and then bring my marketing to it. So yeah, I started working behind the scenes with authors and just helping them with their book launch teams, working with publishers on their book launches, helping with, social media marketing, email marketing, which looks way different now than it did back when I started. But yeah, just helping them find ways to serve their readers and connect with new readers online and free methods, not paid ads, but just always thinking, how can we always be meeting new readers? Because there's always new readers out there to discover our books. And, we don't want to ever forget that. I know you've talked about that on the show too. It's like, we just constantly want to be sharing our message, right? There's always somebody we can be helping with our message. And so that's kind of how I got started. And so I've been doing that since I think 2015 and in different capacities, but I just love it so much.
Yes. Isn't that interesting how we can start out thinking we're headed down one path and God allows us to go there for a time. And then he's like, oop, let's change direction a little
Mhm.
bit. And
Yeah.
yet it doesn't mean that you're never going to write your story. Maybe you have written it since then, but
Mm-mm.
the timing, the timing, right? And so doing it in
Yes.
his timing, and look at all the nuances that he has brought into your life and how you've been able to serve so many other people than if you had charged ahead and just done what you initially wanted to do, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely,
That
yeah, and I
that's
would have
like
missed out on so many blessings for sure if I would have just kept trying to write my story before it was time.
yeah, yeah. But for those of us who are listening and are actively writing our books, though, that's not to discourage you either. It's just to show that God can work in us in many different ways and sometimes surprising ways. And just
Yes.
to be open to what the Lord is sharing with you and follow his leading.
Yes, absolutely, and I'm so glad you said that because I'm sure, like, the fact that it's all these years later have written my book, there might be a little stubbornness on my part too to do what God's called, you know what I mean? Because I do think there's a journey to go on, but whether or not I want to start that journey is a different story. So I know a lot of your listeners can probably relate to that.
Absolutely. Yes. So I know you mentioned couple of times about strategy and how you love to help and them organically find new readers and that kind of thing. Um, so when you're working with clients, what is it that you specifically like the overarching thing that you want to impact your clients with?
Well, right now I've really niched down to podcast guesting.
Okay.
And I've done a lot of things with book launching and social media marketing, email marketing. Along the years, that's changed so much, and people want more interaction directly with the author. So they can still have somebody working on a lot of the things the scenes, but really, they really want to just engage with the author themselves, which is so amazing, right? That we can pop
Yes.
on social or be on a launch team and actually get to engage with the author that we've, fallen in love with and want to help them look at their books. But yeah, so like I've done a lot of things. And a couple of years ago, I had really like niched down to PR because I love that the fact that you can be on podcasts, you can be in publications, you can be on TV and reach people worldwide. And again, it's free, and it's just such an organic way to connect with people you wouldn't be able to reach any other way, right? You couldn't do it on your own. You need to be able to be a guest on other platforms and able to write on other platforms and speak on TV. So I really kind of fell in love with that aspect of it because I knew there was strategy and marketing involved that I could be involved in. And then of course the author is going to show up and do their part. And then probably just a couple of years ago, I really thought podcast guesting is where I wanted to niche down to because PR is a lot, as you know. I mean, PR is just a lot of stuff to work with. And I love listening to podcasts. I mean, I've discovered so many new authors and writers and, bloggers that way. And I'm just constantly listening and learning for all facets of my life about how to make things better right through podcast. And so I really have niched down to podcast guesting, and I'm super passionate about just working with writers and authors to learn how they can maximize this opportunity no matter where are in their journey. Like if they've just started writing their book, they could be building their email list, by sharing a message on podcasts. They could be gathering an email list for a launch team. They could be attracting a publisher by, being able to show them, I've already been a guest on some podcasts. I'm already out there reaching my target readers today, as well as like through your book launch, typically you hear authors on podcasts, as a guest, but then like even way beyond that, like I've worked with several authors that have multiple books, and so it's like you have to think back on, oh, there's still new listeners, new podcasts that haven't heard about this book on my shelf. So why not get out there and serve them today? And then I know a lot of authors are also starting to do coaching and courses and memberships and things. And so it's just a great way, no matter where you are and what your goals are in your author and ministry, that you can definitely reach those by being a guest on podcasts and just reaching new readers and listeners. So that's what I love to do, is just to strategize with authors and writers on how can, is this the right thing for them to be doing right now, and how can they get started doing it?
Oh, and I love your passion for that. It just
Yeah,
shows through when you're
I
talking
am
about
super passionate about
podcasting.
it.
Yes. And so a couple of things came to mind whenever you were speaking. And one is the importance of your backlist. And so many newer authors think, whenever I'm speaking with them, that, oh, I can't market that book anymore. It's, several years old. It's outdated.
Mhm,
No, that, a lot of authors, their main income comes from their backlist once you learn how to
mhm,
market it. And that, of course, is a challenge for so many of us authors, especially indie authors. Um,
mhm,
but also getting on podcasts, we think that sounds great, right? Until we actually get an
mhm,
interview, and then the excitement turns to terror. What do we talk
mhm.
about? How do we do it? And so having someone like you in our back pocket to help us, is that one thing that you do, is to coach them to how to present themselves on a podcast?
Yes, yes, and I've always been kind of the behind the scenes person doing like one-on work pitching authors and landing them guest opportunities. And what I've discovered is, one thing I'm super passionate about sharing with my clients is that it starts with a relationship first. And I know, like, that's how you and I connected, right?
Yes.
We connected on Instagram, and we have started getting to know each other on Instagram, and you reached out with an invitation to serve your listeners, which is such an incredible blessing for an author, to allow you to be a guest and to get to encourage their listeners. And totally lost my train of thought on that. You just asked me. I'm so sorry, Jillian. Totally lost my train of
No,
thought on your question.
that's okay. I lost it too.
I went off. Oh, I know it about building relationships. So I
There we
think
go.
that's really key, is that we do spend some time as guests building relationships before we start pitching. Because I know a lot of authors, especially around book launch time, it's like they just think we just got a mass pitch. Like, we just got to get as
Yes.
many pitches out the door, a guest on as many podcasts in this short little bit of time. But nowadays, that's not really how it works. And so it can be a guest anytime, and it can impact your book sales. And but I do think it begins with starting a relationship with podcast hosts, and I really think that we just forget how impactful it can be. And that's what I hear from my clients, is just that relationship with the podcast host has surpassed any kind of book sales that they
Mm.
could have made on that podcast. And so it's so cool to see all the things that come out of that. So that's why I would rather do more coaching than doing the pitching for them, because I really do think it's super important for authors and writers to put a priority on building those relationships. And then, a podcast host, they want to hear from the guests themselves. They don't want to hear from a PR agent. They want to hear that that guest truly cares about them and their listeners and wants to be a guest. And this is why, and the value they can bring. So, yeah, I just love being able to coach authors and writers on how to do that. It is a
Right.
process, and you
Sure.
do come up with, issues, that you just need to run by a couple of questions by somebody. And I hope that people will think of me as that expertise and coach that can help them through that.
Yeah. So whenever you mentioned that a lot of your clients have found that they've had more sales or better success through podcasting than just, regular sales avenues, can you unpack that a little bit? How does being on a podcast potentially open doors for book sales?
Yeah, so I think most of shows with an interview style is it's going to be like a 30 to 40-minute conversation. And so, of course, that sometimes that scares people, like you were talking about. Sometimes you get fearful of being the guest, but what you don't realize is, because you are being interviewed, well, that time and a half, right? Because there's two people, it's a conversation
Yes.
going back and forth, and it is just like me and Deline today. It's just a one-on-one conversation, although you are, serving listeners. But when you're recording, it's just you and the host, so it's so nice, and you shouldn't have to. Don't be nervous about it. I used to be the same way, but it's just like, just think of your on one talking about your message. But and again, I just lost my
But
I'm so
how the
sorry.
podcast episode can
These, I'm
potentially
so
open doors.
sorry.
No, that's okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I think a lot of my authors that I've worked with, they have already launched their book, so they're
Okay.
post launch and they're
Okay.
wanting to reach new readers with their message. But the thing I've noticed, and this has also changed over the years, is used to there wasn't as many podcasts to listen to, and there weren't as many authors on podcasts. You would hear an author, and you fall in love with them and connect with their personality, and you probably would zip over to their Amazon link, buy their book that day, the episode. You hear the episode, but with so many podcasts out now, we don't always hear that episode that day it airs. So you can't really judge it on that particular day my episode airs. I'm going to see this spike in book sales because it could be that somebody listens to the episode way later. But also I think we're so used to this. We don't have this very long attention span, thanks to social media. We just want things quickly. And so I think sometimes we don't take that next action. Like we hear somebody on a podcast, we might go over their social media profile or we sign up for their email list. They've got a freebie, give us lots of value in that conversation. And then they're like, oh, hey, by the way, if you want to dig in deeper, it's a freebie for you. I'm probably going to click on that more than take the time to get off my podcast app, click over to Amazon and buy a book. And that's not, sometimes it is the case. But what I've seen is, like they might join your email list and you can nurture them to buy your book that way. But or if you want them to be on your social media profile, because again, that's you have your content and they're going to, see that, or you can guide them back to your own podcast if you're trying to grow your own podcast. But what I've seen with the host and the guest is a lot of times, they've gotten to know each other through this 20 to 30-minute conversation. And usually when it wraps up, sometimes the guest is a podcast host. And so they will, reciprocate and be like, wow, this is an amazing conversation. Would you now be my guest on my podcast? So that's going to carry that, relationship at least one step further. And they're going to probably be communicating between there. But I've seen like even afterwards, like they find out, what each other does and how they can help each other. And then I see them pop up like in each other's masterminds, like they'll comment to me, hey, I'm in so-and-so's mastermind now. Like we're really, working together to build our platforms. Or like I had a previous client that's doing a summit this week. And some of her guests were ones that we had booked her on as a guest. And so it's so cool to see all the different ways that collaborations can come out of one interview that you thought you had a different purpose for. And then you see it. I've seen authors and podcast hosts and guests get together and write books together and, or write a chapter in each other's books or, just so many different ways of collaborating, sharing each other's content on social or their email list. It's just, just carrying that on. So it's not just one and done podcast interview. It's really a relationship that's starting that can do so many amazing things when you have God involved.
Absolutely. And I was thinking that too. It kind of goes back to how you experienced it with your work. You started out one direction or thinking one way, and then it blossomed into something else. And it sounds like that can happen with podcasting too.
Yes,
Lots of
absolutely.
different ways that God can use your story, your message, your book to reach different audiences. And so I was just thinking too that trying to think the best way to phrase this. So you mentioned a lot of different options and opportunities with podcasting, and you mentioned about people that were post-launch. What about people that are just starting out? What kind of podcasting should they look to do? Like, they just focus on the message of their book, or what should they talk about, or what angle should they pitch if they're just starting out and they don't have a book finished yet?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, if you're in the writing stage, if you already know what your book's going to be about, you may take topics from that. Because again, your goal might be on to build my email list, right? Maybe a publisher said, we love everything about you, but you need to build your platform, right? And so maybe that's your goal is you want to build the platform. So you may want to take a topic from your book. And oftentimes a lot of our writers that have been around a while, they have tons of blog content, right? That they're repurposing into a book. So they probably know what is some of the most popular content that, readers have reacted to. And you could just, mesh that into a podcast topic. And, so then you're kind of also getting the feel of it, it gives you it's talking about that topic that you want to write about in your book. But also it gives you a chance to, you talk about it on an episode, then you probably have a freebie because you're growing your email list. And then you nurture that email list. And so it's so fun because then the readers are kind of going along that journey, right? They know this is what you're probably going to write your book about if you tell them, or they just know this is what you are about. This is how you want to encourage them. And so, week after week, when you send your emails, you're just, you're growing on that message. And then when it comes time for a book launch team or the book launch, you've definitely nurtured them and they so trust you and they so believe in this message, they're going to want to buy your book. But yeah, so you can do it that way. You can also, I like to challenge writers to think also outside your box. Like a lot of people I've worked with, they are in the mental health field, so they're mental health professionals. So they may also write Christian content and books, and speak on that on Christian topics. But they also have a very secular audience too that they can serve. And so sometimes it's like, just remember that, like you may want to get out there and start serving secular podcast audiences because, oh my gosh, mental health topic, it never goes out of style, right? You can always be sharing something. And then you can be adding that to your platform, right? Because it's a nice thing to be able to show publishers. It's, a way for you to show other podcasts. I've been in this before, but so that like I would think about that is think about topics that maybe doesn't relate to your book necessarily, but if you're serving listeners, they're going to be, encouraged to connect with you afterwards and join your email list or, connect with you on social media. And so I like to think about your, the topic of your book, if you know what it is, or if you definitely know, like you've got this, a niche of your blog, you could talk about that. Or again, you could talk about, something you do in your day job, some kind of also just like some life experiences that you've had. Like I haven't done this much, but I could talk about being a special needs mom, and my son has autism. And so even though that doesn't have anything to do with my business, or maybe I'm not writing a book about it yet, but it is something I am a quote unquote expert on, and I could serve audiences that way and then connect with them and, decide how I want to take that, what direction. But yeah, I think just all the different hats we wear and how we could serve listeners. And, when things happen, just like the hurricane, it just happened when we're recording this. And, there's always seems like sadly there's some kind of tragedy. And if there's anything we can bring to encourage listeners or any kind of a unique, diverse voice we can bring to the conversation, I just want to encourage everybody to, speak up and share with a podcast host that you could do that and you'd love to serve their listeners in that way.
That's so helpful. Thank you for sharing those different views and opportunities, ways to think about pitching podcast guests or podcast hosts as a guest. And I was thinking too that all of this relates back to engaging with others. So often as writers, I know primarily this is not a statistic that I've read anywhere formally done, but the majority of writers that I've spoken with consider themselves introverts. And I think that they love the solitude of writing in their corner, in their room. And then all of a sudden when their book is done, they're flustered and they're unsure and not confident at all in, reaching an audience. So I love how you're sharing that it's all organic. If you start with just one conversation with one podcast host, it's a one-on-one, and yes, that there are people listening, but you're not standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people at once, right?
Yes.
Visibly.
Yes.
So it's just a great way to just start stepping out, start having conversations. And like you said, that one conversation with the podcast host might lead to another conversation with someone else. And then before you know it, you have a little network of other authors and podcast hosts and readers. And you started off the top of the message here saying about how audiences love to engage directly with the author. And again, that might cause some authors to be a little fearful. Oh goodness, how much do I need to share? What do I need to share? But if you just start small and just share a little bit, you'll get the feel for how much to share and what your readers really resonate with. So I love that you shared all of that. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
So I know you said that it's never too early really to start guesting, whether you have your book finished or not. So let's talk about the podcasts themselves. How can they target podcasts? Who should they start reaching out to?
Well, I think if you are going to talk about your writing or your book, really you've probably honed into, and I'm sure Delaney, you probably help authors with this and writers, you have honed into who your target reader is. And I know in our niche, it seems like it's like, well, anybody that listens to a Christian podcast, which might be true. Those, I mean, any Christian podcast might be appropriate, but even some Christian podcasts are more niche down. Like they may only talk to one of my favorite podcasts is the Boy Mom podcast. Well, if your book isn't for boy moms, then you're not pitching that podcast, right? Or one for girl moms, or one that's about marriage, one that's just for moms, in particular. So I really think start with who your target audience is, and go at it that way when you're looking for podcasts to pitch. But I love what you were talking about building your author community, and I think definitely figuring out how you can get in community with other authors because you'll typically find other podcasters there. And two of my favorite podcast groups, I don't know if you're a member of them, Deline, are the Spark, a Christian podcaster,
Yes.
the Spark Christian podcast group, and the Christian Podcasters Association. Both of those Facebook groups. And that's where a lot of Christian podcasters just hang out and they'll share their episodes or they'll share about podcasting. And even if you aren't a podcast, get involved in those groups and just get to know other podcasters. And you'll see them sharing their shows. And it's a great way to kind of look and see. Sometimes they also have threads. It's like, I'm looking for a guest on a particular topic. And so you can kind of start seeing what are out there they are, get to know those hosts because hosts know tons of other hosts, so I think if you start from the relationship aspect of it, it's so much easier. And then also if you know similar authors, similar bloggers, similar authors that have had books out that are similar to what you're writing, or even bloggers that write kind of in that same niche as you, and you know that they have guested on podcasts, is you can easily look in your podcast player and look by their name, and it'll pop up with the podcast that they've been guest on. So then you could, kind of check those out and see if those will be applicable for you to pitch yourself to. But
That's a
I
good
think
tip.
really, just getting a community with people that can tell you shows they listen to. If you haven't built an email list, you could ask your email list. But yeah, just asking people, what shows do you listen to that interview guests, and getting in community with podcast hosts, and just, building those organic relationships and being very, authentic, and, not go into it with what's in it for me,
Right.
always about what's in it for them and their listeners. And so, yeah, I think that's a great way to identify the podcast, is just really starting with who your target listener that you're trying to reach.
And do you think that their number of downloads or the popularity of a podcast factors into it? Like, should you discount ones that are newer podcasts?
No, I definitely would not. And what I have seen, I mean, we all want to be on the big show. It's funny because you ask people and they'll be like, well, I don't know what shows. But then as you start talking about those, then they'll start talking about big shows they listen to, which is great. I mean, a lot of the times the shows, and when we say big shows, they have a lot of downloads. They're top in the category. They probably, a lot of them are solo shows, so they don't even interview guests. So I definitely want to say, like, as you start searching, make sure you're looking for shows that interview guests. But a lot of the big shows, it just depends on what their goal is with their show, and who they interview. Look at like who have they been interviewing, because sometimes they only interview traditional publishers, book authors, because that's where they are, and it's kind of a, they're all exchanging, swapping out guests, right? But I think too, they, sometimes they are doing interviews week in, week out with a new author. So I don't know, maybe the listeners can't afford to buy that many books, right? So you never know what the return might be. But I think definitely I would not discount a new podcast, because what I have found with new podcasts, and maybe podcasts that haven't grown that big yet, is they have a really, really dedicated listenership. And so, that host says, here's my guest, I believe in them, you should go check out their book or join their email list. They trust that host and they're like, take action. And also because they're typically a little bit more niche also. So again, like the Boy Mom podcast, she's only speaking to boy moms. And if you look at shows like that, that's typically how it works, is if they're super niche, then they probably have a super dedicated audience, that shows up day in and day out, and might take action after the show. So I don't know. I think it just really depends on the writer and the author. I mean, if you have relationships with big show hosts, then, definitely cultivate those, and you never know what might come out of it.
Right. Oh, that's great. So I know we've been talking about when to start pitching and, what kind of podcast. Can you just share maybe one or two tips for actually pitching? Like, what do you say to these podcast hosts?
Yeah, and I think as and I would keep this is great with Dylan to be your coach. Is like, we don't really want to write it as short as you can. Like, be as short as you can. That's really hard with a podcast pitch. But again, I think everybody's attention spans and just time. They don't have time to read like a big long pitch. So I've been trying to shorten my own. And you can always link over to your website where you have more information. But the main thing is, you introduce yourself, and it's all about how you're going to bring value to the listeners. And so typically, as writers and authors, like, we feel like when it comes to any kind of media, we want to share all our accolades, and, we're nervous. So we want to share, we've done all these things and we've sold all these books if we're an author, but that's really not what a typical host is looking for. They want you to introduce, yourself really briefly, and then share the topic that you can bring. And I usually share like one topic and a couple of bullets for my talking points, or I might share a couple of topics for them to choose from. But I always customize it to the show, again, because it's a very niche show, and you might speak to the audience a different way, or maybe you're bringing a different perspective. Maybe you've listened to an episode and you heard a particular episode and you're like, oh, my topic would be great. It would, it'd be great to follow up on that episode. I always like to call that out in email. I always like to tell a host if I've left a review, because I encourage always leave a review before you pitch a podcast, and then let them know that you've done that. You care enough to support their show in advance of your pitch. But that's the main thing. It's just, you want to give them a topic so they don't have to think of it on their own, right? And you want to give them a couple of talking points, and then just let them know, you're asking, could I come and serve your listeners as a guest?
Yes, I agree with that 100%. Having been pitched and receiving those, I love it when they offer a topic idea. I also love it when they tell me where I can get their headshots, if I can get it
Yes.
from their websites and so forth. So, just so authors are aware that if you are on a podcast, they're probably going to ask you for the book cover JPEG and a
hmm
headshot. So
Yes.
have those ready in the wings, for whenever they ask, if you don't have it ready when you're pitching. So
Yeah, definitely. And that's what I love about having just a dedicated page on your website, because then you can
yes,
update that as often as you want, but you can just give them the link to that
yes.
in your pitch for sure. And that way there's just one link they can click over and read all about you.
And that's a good point too, because I don't open attachments.
hmm
So from people I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So having a website with the link to where that information, your bio, your headshot, your book cover can be found is ideal. Yeah.
hmm
Yeah, that's great. Oh, thank you so much for sharing all of that. Were there any other tips that were burning on your tongue, ready to share with our listeners before we close today?
No, I think you've covered it. And I know,
Great.
like, I will mention, like, I know you previously had Ruthie Gray on your podcast. So
Yes,
I think that's how we probably originally connected. So she's both of our Instagram coach, and she's
yes,
amazing.
she is.
But I would say, be sure and listen to that episode, because she has a really great challenge that's been going on. And even if you listen to this after the fact, like, just one thing I do encourage authors is, when you do send that pitch, the host will, open it up. They'll likely click over to your website, but if they're active on a social platform, they're going to probably click over to find you on a social platform and to check you out, because especially for those of us that follow Jesus, we want to make sure that people we're connecting with have the same values as we do. And
Exactly.
so it's nice to see that. But also you could do that ahead of time, right? And be able to have something personal you could add to your pitch. So I would definitely make sure you listen to that episode. But yeah, I think just, again, just leading with value, just always making sure that you're, build the relationship first, and all that can just be like leaving a review, making some kind of a connection with the host, so it's not so cold when you pitch. And then, again, having that presence somewhere online, if they go check you out, that it does match up to who you are in the pitch. And again, just making sure you always communicate the value that you need to the listener. So it's not always about your writing or your book, right? It's about the topics from your book that's going to bring value to them today in their busy lives.
Great distinction. Love that. Love that. Love that. Oh, well, thank you so much, Kim, for joining us today. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's so fun to serve your listeners.
Absolutely.